Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perdichizzi, and thank you for joining me as always. Really excited to once again be joined by special guest Graham Barfield of Fantasy Points. Graham, I look forward to this every year, our annual discussing the new running back class. Welcome back to the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast.
Yeah, man, it's good to be back. Always fun to talk to you, talk some ball. It's gonna be a good show. This is a really fun running back landscape. Just playing fantasy this year, playing best ball. I know your show is obviously Devy and Dynasty focused. I think it's a less fun landscape there in that front, but at least for like seasonals and best ball, I think this running back landscape is a lot of fun. I don't know about you, man. I just did a recent Dynasty startup, and this running back landscape is pretty brutal. There's like 6 to 7 backs that I actually like want to invest in, and then it's like a big long flat tier of different risk, different reward. It's a really, really hard time, I think, to be a buyer of running backs in Dynasty.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll go to the rookies in a second, but like even guys that we thought during last season, right before Breece Hall's injury, before Seattle drafted another running back this year on day 2, right?
Exactly.
Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker would have been those guys that probably people were actively wanting to buy in Dynasty. And now, obviously Charbonnet maybe changed the narrative a little bit there with Kenneth Walker. Breece Hall coming back from the injury, reports, whether they're to be believed or not, that the Jets were thinking about taking Jahmyr Gibbs. That seemed like it was far-fetched, but there was a lot of people, Dane Brugler at the top of the list, speaking that narrative, and he's not usually someone just pushing hyperbole out there. So you lead me to believe that it's possible, right? So I feel like the days of like the workhorse running backs that you feel so confident about for years, that's like long by the wayside now. There's a few and far outliers that maybe we feel that way, but it kind of seems like the Dynasty running back landscape is forever now going to be, it's like, it used to be like, maybe we could think about 3 to 4 years. Now It's almost like the running back. It's like, you better think about 1-2 years and we'll see, besides most people. And I think that's what's really changed over the years. We always knew it was a short lifespan and a short, thinking out. I think now it's even shorter than we've ever seen at the running back position, with teams looking to invest more resources, committees, specialty backs, et cetera, et cetera. So let's go into this draft class. Bijan Robinson, obviously a premier back. When you studied him, when you watched him, was he one of the best you've ever studied? Was he near the top? Was he behind that 1 or 2 guys? Just some overall takes on what you thought of Bijan when you evaluated him.
Sure. So I did not do yards created this year. I had to take the year off. Unfortunately, just time constraints. I'm hoping that next year, not only will I be able to do the 2024 class, I'll actually be able to go back and back chart. I should have some time. So no yards created data this year, unfortunately, but I'm obviously super familiar with the class. I spent as much time as I could watching. We've all been watching Bijan since 2020. Dude's been, I think, the best running back in college football since he became the starter. The question is, obviously, what can he not do? It's pretty much everything. I think he's right on par with Saquon Barkley as the best running back prospect that I've seen come out in now my 10 years of playing and analyzing backs and playing fantasy. He's right there. Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, he's in that tier. This year for fantasy, I think, at least for seasonals, I think he's priced pretty much at his ceiling. I actually have Austin Eckler ahead of Bijan in my rankings, and that's a number of different things. It's Eckler just having, obviously the pedigree. Chargers offense is significantly better. I think Eckler will catch fewer balls this year, but with more efficiency. The question with Bijan for me, the only question I have for fantasy is just to what extent Tyler Algier and Cordero Patterson are going to be involved. But, we just started at the top of the show. Which running backs do you want to invest in fantasy? Bijan's obviously the one. If you still have a rookie draft you're doing, Bijan is the clear 101 in Superflex, all rookie drafts. I have not wavered for that one, and he's been my 101 for the 2023 class since probably 2020. So yeah, lock and load Bijan. This year I think he is priced. If you're playing seasonals, you're playing best ball, I think he's priced correctly. I don't think there's a whole lot of equity in terms of upside, I don't think Bijan finishes as the RB1 this year. I don't think that's in his range of outcomes. I think there's too many good backs on too many good offenses that can do it. Falcons need a big, they would need a big leap, man. We would need a big leap from Desmond Ridder. But I think obviously we're all in on Bijan's talent.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, right? Like you talked about, there's not a ton of running backs that you want to invest in. So when you're talking even redraft or best ball, right? There's McCaffrey, there's Eckler, and then you start to get into the mix with Bijan there for sure. And you're right, he's priced as having a star-studded season with those other wide receivers. And you know, in terms of rookie drafts and startup dynasties, I think we all know that Bijan, you know, sits atop there in terms of the running back rankings for sure. If we pivot this over to Jahmyr Gibbs, when you look at Jahmyr Gibbs, obviously the Lions made an investment in him that was even greater than, you know, most people expected in terms of draft capital. Whispers that he maybe could have went even as high as 6 if they didn't trade back, which is wild. When you look at Jahmyr Gibbs, I've been on record as saying, like, I understood the usage comparisons to Alvin Kamara, but the size frame to me reminded me, you just talked about him, like if he hits his ceiling, I think he could be more on the Austin Eckler type because there was like a 15-pound difference between Kamara to Jahmyr Gibbs where the Eckler size frame fits a little bit better. Is that how you kind of see him best being utilized, very similar to Austin Eckler type? And where do you kind of look at him this year? Are you in on him in all formats? Do you have more concerns about David Montgomery taking too much work, that maybe he's a little bit, you know, overinflated in redraft or best ball? What's your thoughts on Jahmyr?
Love Jahmyr Gibbs' tape. Obviously, the pass catching ability pops off immediately. He's so good, you know, and fluid in space. Extremely creative. I think he's a much better receiver than DeAndre Swift was coming out. And by the way, I was, you know, we can go back and run the tape. You and I talked about DeAndre Swift years ago. I was a huge DeAndre Swift fan. Here's the thing, Paul. I mean, running backs that get drafted this early, they tend to produce very, very quickly in fantasy. Since 2010, there have been 11 running backs taken inside the top 15 overall. Gibbs was taken 12th. 8 of those 9 previous running backs finished as an RB1, that's top 12 by fantasy points, within their first 2 years. They had at least one RB1 season within their first 2 years. 8 of the 9 did. The only one who didn't was CJ Spiller, fantasy catnip for longtime fantasy players. CJ Spiller was the only one who really didn't live up to expectations, at least in terms of fantasy. I'm buying Jahmyr Gibbs, especially in PPR leagues, especially when he goes in the 4th round of PPR drafts for seasonals, best ball. I think he's a little bit worse of a bet in half point PPR or standard leagues where you don't get points for reception, just because, like you mentioned, I think Montgomery is going to be heavily involved, especially near the goal line. But all of that being said, you know, Gibbs could score 6-7 touchdowns this year only. You know, I'm putting air quotes on only 6-7 touchdowns. It still finishes like the RB 15 or 16, just because I think he's going to have such a great role in the passing game.
Yeah, I mean, and you like to think when teams invest in a player that you got to know how to utilize them and take advantage of it. I think right now, Ben Johnson, that offensive coordinator, is one of those OCs that we look at with a guy with a plan, a guy who knows how to be creative, a guy who will know how to maximize the skill sets and the traits of his players that he has on his roster. So I think there's more than enough. Like, I think sometimes in fantasy, we worry too much about, is there an alpha wide receiver? Does that mean that the other guy who's number 2 can't be great? I remember that conversation years ago with Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones. And I think we even see that now in the backfields, and people got to be more open that we've already talked about it. That true bell cow, they're going to be like 5 or 6 if we're lucky anymore in a normal year. That, like, yeah, it's probably best for Jahmyr Gibbs if he's not that. Like, think about it, the Chargers have wanted to find the compliment to Austin Eckler forever. They've tried almost every year with that like early day 3 pick, and no one's really materialized. And they've just always had to find their way back into giving Eckler this monster workload. I don't think out of want, more out of necessity. And I think, you know, right now, Montgomery being there might even, he'll steal some short yardage touchdowns for sure. But I think it's something where Gibbs will get touches that are more valuable for fantasy, right? It's your you know, partner over there, right? Scott Barrett always talks about how much more like a reception or a target is worth in fantasy for running backs than a carry is. And I think that's what we want out of Jahmyr Gibbs. We want those high value touches. And I think we're gonna see a lot of that early on this year. That kind of takes us through the easy to talk about running backs from this rookie class. after that, now I think really opens the floor. Recently I had on Mike Clay and Sigmund Bloom were my two previous guests. And, we talked about it, and those are two guys I respect tremendously in the industry, and they kind of look at it a little bit differently. Sig's into Devin A-Chain and, Ty J Spears and their big playability. Mike Clay's a little bit down on them and has a lot of concerns about the size, especially for Devin A-Chain. And he prefers more Charbonnet and Kendra Miller. Where do you kind of lie on the next wave of running backs from this rookie class, whether you want to take a little bit of a redraft perspective first and then maybe a little bit a bigger picture dynasty perspective, because I do think there's a lot of ways you can go with that next wave of running backs from this rookie class.
Yes, there is. It is a really interesting RB3 through RB10. I think it's been when I know I said I didn't do yards created. When I was initially looking at this class, I was like, man, there's really no difference between RB3 and like RB8. And I'm still sitting here on July 12th, Paul, and I still really feel about the same way. There's really not a huge difference between RB3 and RB8. It's really eye of beholder, very much an eye of the beholder class. I will say I share similar concerns to Mike Clay about A-Chain's size. He's 188 pounds. There are just very few backs that come in sub 195 that end up being fantasy relevant. I did a study on this, and I'm actually going to write an article about it later this offseason if I have a little bit of time, about undersized running backs, because A-Chain and Gibbs, a couple of guys in this class are undersized. And what I found was that just very rarely do these backs that are sub 190, sub 195, 195 pounds, they just very rarely see enough rushing volume. In fact, there's only been a few running backs that have carried the ball more than 12 times on average per season at 195 or less. And there's only a handful that have done it multiple times. Warrick Dunn is really the only guy who's been sub 195 and had multiple seasons of 12 or more carries. Now we can go back to the whole debate with A-Chain of, this will be a committee backfield. This, the whole point is, he'll be the passing down back, yada, yada, yada. The point is I'm very concerned that he will not be able to have enough rushing volume to really matter too much in fantasy. I'm more into Charbonnet and Kendre Miller as well, but I'm not exactly excited to draft either of those guys. I thought Ken Walker was the RB1 in last year's class. I loved Breece Hall, but I thought Walker was an extremely special runner, and we saw that on display last year. I mean, he was one of the best home run hitters in the NFL. I think Charbonnet will come in and kind of just be the backup to Ken Walker. If you look at the Seahawks depth chart last year, they had no depth after Rashad Penny got hurt. They had literally no depth. It was Ken Walker and Travis Homer. I think Pete Carroll went into this draft and was like, okay, Ken Walker is still the 1A. We got to get somebody that's a bigger back that can play all three downs, that can pass block, that can play, that can take red zone carries too. I think Charbonnet is going to play a little bit in the red zone. All of that being said, I still think he's just a timeshare back behind a he's the less talented version in the backfield. I like Ty J Spears quite a bit for best ball this year, though. I'll take it that direction. I think he is significantly underpriced in PPR leagues for his pass catching ability. Obviously, there's massive contingent upside. We don't have to talk too much about that. If Derrick Henry were to sustain a massive injury or miss a lot of time, Ty J Spears is really the only guy on the depth chart that is capable of handling a big workload. Obviously, the big concern with Spears, though, Paul, is he doesn't have an ACL. There was multiple reports that came out that he has basically arthritis in his knee. He was still healthy enough last year to handle 250 plus touches, which to me signals that maybe he's got 1, 2, 3 years, which, like we just talked about, that's the window we're operating under. Anyway, these 1 to 2, 3 year windows. I think Ty J Spears is a fine pick in the third round of rookie drafts. If you're still doing rookie drafts, especially if you need a short-term back. I am not expecting long-term numbers from him because of his knee, but I actually think he's probably the one out of the Charbonnet, A-Chain, Kendre Miller group that's most likely to produce this year. I think if you just think of it logically, Derrick Henry is about to be 29. He's going into his age 30 season. He's 29 now. He'll be 30 at the end of the year. If the Titans are going to do anything in the AFC, they've got to get a second back involved to keep Henry healthy. The last guy I want to talk to you about, and I want to get your opinion on this Bears backfield, because Roschon Johnson, man, I mean, he was stuck behind Bijan, but holy crap, his tape popped. I mean, this dude, I felt like if you plopped him into a FBS school with a decent offensive line and you just gave him 250 touches, we would be talking about Roschon Johnson in the same light as Zach Charbonnet. It's just he was behind Bijan. We just didn't get a huge sample of him. I absolutely loved his small sample of tape. Roschon is, just for this year, I think I like Roschon better than Kendre Miller, especially with Alvin Kamara most likely not going to be suspended that long. Jamal Williams in tow there with the Saints. I think Kendre Miller is actually, ironically, my favorite dynasty pick out of this whole RB3 through RB10 group, because he's, 1, extremely young, 2, loved his tape, 3, Kamara and Jamal Williams are most likely going to be gone next year. So Kendre is probably my favorite in dynasty. This is an extremely long-winded answer. But there is a lot to talk about between these guys. I want to pick your brain on Roschon because this Bears backfield is one that I can't figure out.
Yeah, I mean, Roschon was a guy that I had him higher. I wasn't a huge Charbonnet fan. He was like 7 or 8 for me. He wasn't in my top 3, top 5. Roschon Johnson was. I loved Roschon. So nice. I'm right there with you. Him and Tank Bigsby were kind of my guys that I thought the general consensus was sleeping on a little bit. And I think, I know they brought in, I think by the second half of the year, Roschon starts to clearly run away, I think, with the most work in that backfield. I think it might be a little bit slow to start. He is a day 3 pick. I don't think it's the same situation as Dameon Pierce. Right. I think there's more in the Bears backfield. Khalil Herbert, who I genuinely like as a talent. I liked him when he was coming out of VTech. He had some glimpses. I think he's a good player. I think he could be a productive guy. And then Donta Foreman, has shown the ability to be, a guy who can move the chains and be that power inside rusher. So I think there's a little bit more he's got to work through than Dameon Pierce. It kind of just, the floodgates opened up, right? It was Rex Burkhead had that weird week 1 last year before Dameon Pierce kind of seized it. And that was it. I don't expect that to be the case with Roschon. I think it'll be a little bit more committee early on, but I kind of think there the talent is going to rise. And like you said, if he was playing just about anywhere else, but like Texas, and a few other spots, I think we're talking about a guy who would have probably rushed for 1,200 yards in college, would have caught 40 passes, because I do think he has a 3-down skill set. So yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm intrigued by him. I think he's a guy that, the day 3 capital is not something that you feel safe about. We've been through that. We've been down that road before, the Michael Carter, and other ones in the past. So I don't think you feel safe about that. But at the same time, I think he's a unique scenario that if he was somewhere else and there was more evidence of him being the guy who could be the bell cow and make more explosive plays, I think we maybe would have seen him go in the day 2 mix there. So yes, I'm intrigued by him. And then you brought up Tyjae Spears. And I think the thing about Tyjae Spears is if Tennessee doesn't get off to a decent start, and they always seem to overplay their expectations, right? They do that better than just about anybody in the league. There's a real chance that the Titans at some point have to start fielding trade offers. And we know the market at the running back position, it's not a lot, but if they're sitting there and they pull the plug on Tannehill and they go to Will Levis, I think they have to at least see if they can get a day 2 pick for Derrick Henry at this point. So it could even open up a little bit more for Tyjae Spears than we might think. And if they really hand over the whole reins to Will Levis for the following year, is it really, is Derrick Henry really the guy if they're going to fully hit the reset button and the reload button? So I think that opens up the door a little bit more for a guy like Tyjae Spears. Then the next guy I want to pick your brain on, and I mentioned him, Tank Bigsby. Travis Etienne is there, and I feel like Etienne is a very polarizing person on Twitter right now. Some are really concerned about him. Some are still under the belief he was a pass catching running back coming out of college, which I don't know how that narrative ever started. I think just because he's fast, people thought that he was good at that. He really never was. He was okay at it his final year at college when he went back there, surprisingly. What's your thought on Tank and even tie in Travis Etienne? Because I know a lot of people, are on one side of another. I know I just drafted Travis Etienne. I think it was round 5 in the Scott Fish Bowl as my second running back. So just thoughts maybe on the Jacksonville, the Bigsby and Etienne.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. I have no clue where the Etienne is a great pass down back narrative came from. I mean, he had a lot of bulk receptions in his final couple years at Clemson. But again, this is why yards created is so important. I have to bring it back. When I was charting Etienne, I was like, man, he's just not running routes though. Most of these catches are coming on just screens and stuff. And that's exactly what the numbers board out in college. the overwhelming majority of Etienne's catches in college came on screens, flat routes. Just he's not a route runner. And I think I even noted in my breakdown, like he's not just a natural hands catcher. I think last year Etienne was a highly underrated runner, though. He was basically a rookie coming off one of the worst injuries you can have as a running back. I mean, it's either you hurt your knee or you badly injured your foot. Etienne came back. He had, in my mind, the same or even slightly better burst than I remember from him at Clemson. I mean, we've all been watching Etienne since, 2018, 2019. I think Etienne is the clear lead back in Jacksonville. I think Tank is a functional backup who can play all three downs if you asked him to. But if we're going to compare athletic traits, explosive ability, Travis Etienne is the clear number one. I also think this is like a perfect marriage of Etienne and Doug Peterson. Peterson's scheme is just very much it's zone heavy, but they also scheme up some looks where Etienne is basically just like pointing and shooting. And that's the type of offense he needs to be in. He needs to be in a point and shoot, give me a direction and just go. I was reading some articles from Etienne and the running backs coach there. They're saying, there was a lot of meat left on the bone that Etienne had last year. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, he's absolutely right when I was watching Jags games this year, but Etienne still ran for well over 1,000 yards. All of his advanced metrics were good in terms of yards after contact and missed tackles forced. So, again, there's these narratives that we get built up, and I don't know what it's been with Etienne. There's been this, like, fantasy community bias against him that he was a passing down back, which he never was. And now everybody thinks he's a mid runner, and I don't get that at all either. Anybody that looks into the numbers or actually watches the games, I don't see how you could think that. All of that being said, for fantasy though, Paul, I mean, we're still projecting touches. We're still projecting range of outcomes, and Tank Bigsby definitely hurts Etienne's ceiling in totality. We want Etienne on the field 70% of the time like he was last year. Even though he wasn't getting a ton of targets, he was on the field a ton. I think Bigsby will eat into Etienne's snap share quite a bit, but I do not think Etienne is in danger of like losing his job as the 1A runner. If anything, I think Bigsby will play more in passing downs than people think, and I think Bigsby is the far superior pass blocker. Etienne has never been a good pass blocker. He never will be. That's probably not his game. We want Etienne, running those check downs and screens anyway. I think Bigsby's role, at least early in the season, will be as a pass blocker and change of pace back to the one Travis Etienne.
Yeah, and I think Etienne, while he will lose some percentage, I think, in the snap share, I think it could be offset by the fact that I think if Jacksonville has that next gear in their offense, right, if this is the year that Trevor Lawrence is going to break out and be a flat-out superstar, it might not matter for fantasy, right? It might – Travis Etienne, like, is still, I think – there's a world where even as we get concerned about Tank Bigsby, that he still has a really great fantasy season if that offense takes off with the addition of Calvin Ridley and Trevor Lawrence just takes another step in his progression. Jacksonville's still an offense that I'm looking to want to invest in, and I still think there's room there. Like they said, like the coach said, his meat left on there for Etienne, and like you said, this is only really his second year, and it's another year removed from that major injury. So I'm still in on Travis Etienne, even though I do like Tank Bigsby there. We'll see how that kind of plays out. From the other day 3 running backs, is there one other guy that you're intrigued with? Whether, obviously we got to see, it sounds like Joe Mixon's going to be there unless something happens late here and pushes, that situation differently. We'll see about Saquon. I think some way he's going to be there by week 1. But is it Eric Gray? Is it, Chase Brown? Is it Chris Rodriguez in Washington? Is it Evans with the Rams? Is there another day 3 running back, 1 or 2 names that you're a little intrigued with, either for redraft, just as a stash, or somebody maybe you're like, you know what, I'm intrigued with him enough, at least for Dynasty, and let's see what happens?
For Dynasty, Chris Rodriguez is one guy that's kind of made my list in late 4th round, early 5th round picks in rookie drafts. This is one guy that Scott Barrett liked quite a bit, just from an analytical perspective. And I trust Scott, and in terms of his analytics, just right up there with anybody. Eric Bieniemy, Chiefs' new offensive coordinator, basically went out of his way to pick Rodriguez. And look, he's a 6th round rookie who does not have just an amazing college pedigree, But if you just look, I think we're kind of striking on a tone here where you and I are, we haven't said it, but we're thinking the same way. We're investing in offenses. We're thinking of these running backs in terms of how the Jags project as a whole, right? Like Trevor Lawrence could have an Andrew Luck type of season this year where he just blows up. All of that being said, I don't think the Commanders are that this year. But if you just look down the road, right, like they could be very well in line for a very early pick next year. There's one. Two, Brian Robinson is not – I like Brian Robinson quite a bit. I was a big Brian Robinson fan, but he's not guaranteed to start a job beyond week 1 this year. And this coaching staff has not really shown us they love Antonio Gibson. I think Ron Rivera has had his kind of way with this backfield. I think Bieniemy is going to be able to take over the offense and really make it his own. And if this is if it's merit-based – and he loves Chris Rodriguez, I think Rodriguez has a real chance out of all of these guys to produce not just next year, but actually at the end of this year, depending on how this backfield shakes out. Yeah,
it's going to be interesting to see, does Rodriguez get that opportunity? And like you said, does the Commanders offense, if they get an early pick next year and it lands to Caleb Williams or Drake May or another quarterback emerges, to go near the top of the draft, we could see that offense start to click a little bit, and they don't have things locked in at the running back position. So it opens the door a little bit. Before I get you out of here, let me ask you, you mentioned Brian Robinson. So let me go back to last year's running back class and just pick your brain for a second. Some of the guys who I think last year, we may see them take a step this year, whether it's usage, maybe it's become an all-around runner from the likes of Rachaad White in Tampa Bay, James Cook in Buffalo, Pacheco, who we obviously saw finish out the season strong. You mentioned Brian Robinson. Is there one or two of those that you're most intrigued with? Because I feel like the range is very wide, right? Some people are like, yeah, James Cook could be the discount version of Jahmyr Gibbs. And other people are like, well, maybe he's Devin A-Chain and he's just not big enough and he can't have a major role. On some of those second year guys, is there one or two that you're most intrigued with?
Yeah, Brian Robinson for sure is the number one guy. Look, I mean, obviously what happened in August between him getting shot, sustaining bullet injuries in his butt and his leg, it's been interesting, I'll say, to see people on Twitter saying, he's not good. Yeah, he wasn't good to start the year because the dude was trying to come back from gunshot wounds. At the end of last year, Robinson was more like the player I saw at Alabama. Surprisingly good burst for a player of his size. I think, we get too hung up on sex appeal at the running back position. What coaches really like is, can you pick up what's blocked first? Secondly, what do you provide after what's blocked? And Brian Robinson is a bulldozer. When he's right, man, he's not elusive in terms of his lateral agility, but he can absolutely make some guys miss with either subtle burst. He's got good power. I think there's a chance that B-Rob plays more on passing downs this year too. The running back coach for the Commanders was talking about that this offseason, that he was surprised at how good of a pass catcher Brian Robinson was. That didn't really surprise me. I thought he was pretty good at Alabama. I mean, he's not Austin Eckler. He's not Christian McCaffrey, but he can catch it a little bit. Definitely excited for B-Rob this year, and I'm really just excited to see how this Commanders backfield plays out as a whole. Rachaad White, man, that he is one guy I've gone back and forth on all offseason. On the one hand, I was not a big fan of him as a prospect. Love his pass catching ability. Did not think he was a very good runner. Last year, the numbers showed that. I mean, he was really bad as a runner, right there with Leonard Fournette in terms of his efficiency. If you look at his man blocking, zone blocking, rush attempts, all of it. White really struggled last year, but he was a good pass catcher. Not surprising. All of that being said, I mean, we're walking into a situation here where the depth chart is him and Keyshawn Vaughn, if that stays, Rachaad White is going to end up being one of the best ball values just based on volume. I'm not a big believer in the player, but it's one of those situations, Paul, where if we're projecting touches, I think Rachaad White is certainly in a great spot. I still think they can sign a veteran though, which might throw a whole wrench in that backfield.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, there's still veterans out there. who can change some backfields, as we head into training camp or even during training camp or before the season starts for sure. Graham, thank you so much for hopping on here. Always a pleasure to talk some running back prospects with you. I'm sure most of my audience is following you, but please let them know where to follow you. Let them know if there's anything you're specifically working on there over at Fantasy Points that you want to share out as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you. At Graham Barfield on Twitter. Really excited for this, Paul, though. We have a brand new product coming out. For the last 2 years, we've been behind the scenes. Our development team, our data collection team have been charting every single NFL game for the last 2 years. We are launching in 5 days our new Fantasy Points data suite, which will have every single tool you could imagine for fantasy football. We're going to have these tools will be able to have split features, so you can sort through basically any stat that you could possibly think of. We have splits for, just for example, if you're looking at the receivers page like I was this morning, you can split out production by, where they're running their routes out wide in the slot. You can split that for team defense to see what production team defenses are giving up to outside receivers. This tool is unbelievable. Myself, Scott Barrett, Brett Whitefield, Chris Wecht, and our development team have been working on this hard. So we're really excited to launch this, and I think it's going to be a game changer for the fantasy space. So that's definitely one thing to keep an eye out for in the next couple of days.
Guys, make sure you're following Graham. Make sure you're subscribing over there at Fantasy Points. Top-notch stuff there. I've always gone on record. I buy a few subscriptions every year. Fantasy Points is locked and loaded as one of my few that I purchase every single year. It will help you tremendously. Make sure you're going over there and subscribing. So, on behalf of Graham, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nakano, and myself, thank you for joining us, and we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.